there were two talks that were scheduled for this live that then was put online. So the first was a talk by Thomas Huebl, and it was trying to remember that. I'll just look at the title of the talk. It's quite an interesting title.
Global social witnessing.
Right, right. Thank you. Global social witnessing. And then following on from that talk, there was a dialogue between Thomas Huebl and Otto Scharmer, who often mentions in his teachings. And Otto Scharmer is the person who came up with this theory U, which is a kind of theory of social change, I guess. But he says he's not, doesn't consider himself really as a meditator, but more as a kind of social theorist. But this waiting a bit for Martin, but I think he's busy with something, so I'll continue. Yeah, but it recognizes that this theory has a great deal in common with the viewpoint that's coming from the contemplative tradition, or from people like Thomas Huebl, who is, I suppose, I mean, he's a teacher of meditation, but he's also somebody who's very deeply versed in psychology. And it's a lot of these, very, what I relate to as very transformational teachings that are happening at the moment, are coming from people who have a deep grounding both in spiritual meditative tradition and in some form of psychology. And the theory U, Otto Scharmer's theory, he said was inspired by Francisco Varela. I don't know if any of you know about him, but he was a psychologist and a biologist, and he, relatively early in his career, he died unfortunately quite young, some time ago, but for a long period, he had a close association with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He was a meditator, and his critique of current psychology, which Otto Scharmer mentioned, was based on the view that science in general, but psychology in particular, has in contemporary Western science has the problem that it's totally grounded in this objective mode of consciousness that I spoke about earlier. It looks at the external as something separate from the person looking at it, and it has no ability to look at looking. Right? If our awareness is totally focused on what's going on outside, then we don't have the ability to be aware of and to. Sorry about that. Okay. So Martin, I'm sorry that you missed that last bit, because I was just beginning. I was just beginning to. Dee asked me to talk a little bit about the content of the talks, and I was explaining a bit about that. I mean, I'll just pick up from that point, because I actually was talking a little bit about the background to the talks. Right. And I was talking about, I'll just finish this and I'll wind back to where the talk itself was coming from. But this is part of the background. So the dialogue was between Thomas Huebl, who's mainly a teacher of meditation, but also somebody who's very knowledgeable in psychology, and Otto Scharmer, who's more of a social theorist and a social psychologist. And Otto Scharmer said that his work was was inspired originally by the work of Francisco Varela, who worked very closely with the Dalai Lama, and he was the main person really who was responsible for setting up the Mind and Life conferences, where the Dalai Lama has, over the past many years, I think 30 years or more, met every 2 years with Western scientists and psychologists, a dialogue between, the Buddhist worldview and the worldview of modern science. And
Well, there's not
Francisco's
one down in California where Alan Wallace is involved in, is it?
Alan Wallace has been involved in every single one because he is one of the main translators, but also a contributor. Yes, that's right. So it was set up by Francisco Varela in about, I think, the early 1980s. And well, maybe 1990, thereabouts. Anyway, Francisco de Varela's critique of modern Western science and psychology was that it does not have a way of investigating systematically the experience of the person. So it looks at people from a third person point of view, from the outside. It doesn't have a way of talking about our first person experience, our own subjective experience of the world. And that's what he brought in to his own scientific work in psychology. It's been very influential. And psychology has changed profoundly since then, partly as a result of him and other teachers like Daniel Goleman, who also was a Harvard psychologist who studied with many Tibetan lamas and so on. So this theory that of Otto Scharmer's is a theory of social change that is based on two different paths of response to the situations, and particularly where there is a situation that is very challenging, like the present situation, that we can go in two directions. We can go in the direction of moving towards this reality that is confronting us and keeping our mind open to register what is actually going on, and keeping our heart open to empathize and relate with how it is affecting other people. And keeping also, he talks about an open mind, open heart, open will, curiosity, compassion, and courage. So, we can respond in this positive way, which is the downward view. In his diagram, I mean, it's upward really, but he's put it in the bottom half of the diagram. So we first of all, we see, we recognize what is going on, and the opposite response would be to be blind to it, to be in denial. So we've seen, as was to be expected, President Trump saying, "It's okay, there's no problem, everything's under control," denial, isn't it? And we see this all the time, and that, of course, is a response based on fear, isn't it? So if we have courage, if we have the courage to confront the situation, and the courage to keep our heart open and respond with compassion, and the courage to participate, to get involved, to be active in the situation, rather than just sitting back in our armchair and looking at it, then we can do something constructive. Otherwise, we go down, so the seeing, sensing, right? Listening, not just with our intellect, but with our body and our emotions to what's going on. And then I forget what the third one was. Anyway, responding. So we can go in either of these two, on a downward spiral or an upward spiral. And then, this eventually feeds back into the situation itself. So it's, a feedback loop. So that's a little bit of what Otto Scharmer was talking about. And Thomas Huebl, his perspective, as I say, is more from meditation, psychology. He talks a lot about neuroscience, but in a different way to what it's often talked about. It's often talked about in a very reductionist way, that, we can understand the mind through understanding the brain. Yeah. He's not saying that, but he's saying that, we respond to the world and to others through our nervous system. And our nervous system, one of the main ways in which it functions is as a resonator. So the energy and the vibrations that are going on, if you like, in our nervous system respond to and resonate with what's going on outside in the other person. So in the previous talk that we looked at last week, he talked about this, how we can, first of all, when our nervous system is thrown into a very sort of fragmented, chaotic response because of distressing, difficult situations, we can come back to awareness and being in the present moment, and being aware of what's going on in our body, in our nervous system, the energy that is swirling around within us. And through that awareness, then we can retune that energy, we can bring it back into calmness and harmony. And also, because we resonate with others, we can also do that with others. So by mindful listening and being present to the other person, we can help them to retune their energy. And then we're moving on from that through kind of doing that kind of practice and contemplative practice together, then we can create a collective field of psychic energy that is positive and that is, helping the situation. So he's speaking in those kind of terms. And yeah, so global witnessing. And in the meditation earlier, I tried to open up a space for us to begin to practice this, that, yes, we read in the newspapers and we hear on the radio and so on, but we also have an ability somehow, when we can make our thinking mind quiet, to just simply pick up what's going on in the wider world, to sense it, to be aware on that level. Now that is deeper than the analytical thinking mind. And so, as long with all great spiritual teachers say the same thing, continually calling us back to the present moment, because only in the present moment can we be truly aware, actually. If we're not in the present moment, then we are, we're caught up in speculating about the future, but our way of thinking about the future is entirely conditioned by the past. If we're not in the present moment, being aware of the present moment, we cannot respond to what is actually going on now. So he's talking a lot about how we can, use our contemplative practice, which we've all practiced, we all have some ability to do it, to quieten the thinking mind and to trust our innate wisdom and our innate intelligence to respond to the reality of what is going on, not just within the confines of my own skin, if you like, but because I do not exist separate and independent from the rest. I exist solely through causes and conditions and interdependence with everything else. Therefore, everything, the whole, is present within me. I can allow my awareness to connect with that whole. Okay. And Thomas Huebl made a very interesting point, a very interesting comment on a passage in the Bible.
Yeah.
Where the people of Israel were assembled on the Mount Zion, and God spoke to all the people, not just to Moses, not just through Moses to the people, is what he was usually doing, but he spoke directly to the people. They were all assembled. And the very interesting comment that he makes is at the end of this passage, it says, everyone said, God spoke to me personally. So this universal voice, which in that monotheistic tradition we call the voice of God, in the Buddhist tradition we might call it something else. We might call it the Dharmakaya, or the mind of clear light, or or the one mind, whatever we want to call it. If we can allow our personal stream of chatter to become quiet, we can hear that voice. And the point that Thomas Huebl was making was, when that voice is speaking about that which is universal, the totality, the overall situation that we're all part of, it does so in a very specific personal way to each person. So each person has a unique relationship to that whole. Each person is a part of that whole, and therefore, in a sense, the whole is part of each one of us. So we are not kind of having to go out and gather a lot of data and formulate a scientific theory to understand what's happening in the world. We have another way of becoming aware of it directly through just listening to the larger mind that each one of us mind is a part of.